Mary Pratt Schueth petitioned the South Carolina Assembly for her back pay in 1783, a couple of years after the American Revolution had come to a close. Like many women in the new republic, she now felt empowered to approach her government in a way she had not in the years before the Revolution. Her political consciousness had no doubt grown with her support for the Patriot cause. She had risked her job before war had been officially declared by refusing to reveal the names of rebels who had stolen gunpowder from the Charleston storage depot, and she had continued to funnel supplies to the Patriots as the war unfolded. Small wonder she was fired when the British briefly took control of Charleston. Schueth felt empowered to petition her state legislature after the Revolution, but her wartime patriotism had gained her little else. For women in the new republic, husbands or fathers were supposed to be their political representatives. Although women participated widely in the Revolution, as their political consciousness had grown, the rights they gained were different from those given to men. Rather than gaining full status as citizens, women were entrusted with the responsibility of training their children to be responsible leaders of the new republic. While men assumed an increasingly direct relationship with the state, women's relationships to their government continued to be mediated largely through their households. Households of the 18th century had undergone important transformations, however, in British North America. The religious enthusiasm of the Great Awakening and the intellectual challenges of the Enlightenment undermined fundamental assumptions about patriarchal authority. Even the consumer items increasingly available for purchase had begun to transform social relationships within households. Women and men increasingly viewed themselves as companions in marriage. As a result, women were mistresses of a new kind of household, and the power they wielded within their homes was necessarily transformed. English control of the eastern seaboard expanded dramatically in the last half of the 17th century, as England conquered New Netherland in 1664, transforming it into New York, and set up the new colonies of Carolina, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. Additional colonization took place with the creation of Georgia, New Hampshire, and Vermont in the 18th century. The British Empire expanded even farther at the conclusion of the 7 Years' War between France and England. Known as the French and Indian War in North America, France surrendered its claims east of the Mississippi River to England in the Treaty of Paris of 1763. These colonization efforts took a toll, of course. Thousands of settlers in frontier areas lost their lives in Indian attacks during the French and Indian War. Urban dwellers, particularly in Boston, faced other dangers. Approximately 3,500 men were recruited into service for British campaigns in Latin America during the Anglo-Spanish War of the 1740s, and most of the men never returned home. The expansion of the British Empire in North America went hand in hand with a growing capitalist revolution in which new consumer goods from abroad, exchanged for raw materials from the colonies, transformed the lives of women as well as men. Indeed, while men were almost always the merchants who arranged this transcontinental trade, women were also at the forefront of these activities, selling goods in their shops or hawking their produce on city streets, cultivating rice in the Carolinas or tending tobacco in the Chesapeake region and further inland, supervising dairy work on their farms, or presiding over their tea tables in the cities. The exchange of goods created in different parts of the world and increasingly sold for money formed the basis of an expanding market economy that began to affect both social relationships and personal identities. In large cities and small, women participated extensively in local businesses. Anne Shields and Jane Vobe, for example, both ran taverns in Williamsburg, Virginia. Their work was not uncommon. Women ran most of the taverns in Virginia. If the women were married, their husbands might have held the licenses, but advertisements made it clear that women were in charge of the taverns. Officials in northern cities also granted licenses to widows in need so that they would not require public assistance. In South Carolina, married women actually owned as well as operated taverns because South Carolina had the strongest laws in the colonies protecting the rights of married businesswomen. They were allowed to sign legal documents and contract debts independent of their husbands, a privilege the women of Charleston were not reluctant to use in setting up their shops. In Boston and Philadelphia, women operated close to 50% of the city's shops. Mary Channing supervised a large dry goods store in Boston, while Lydia Hyde sold tea and dry goods from her shop in Philadelphia. Other women worked as artisans, making candles or buttons or tailored clothing. While women were seldom legally apprenticed to learn these trades, they often picked up their skills informally from their fathers and husbands, and it was not uncommon for a widow to take over her husband's business when he died. While cities were the epicenters of the new consumer economy, women in rural areas were hardly isolated from the growing marketplace. In the 18th century, women on farms and in villages throughout New England learned to spin and sew at a young age. Often working together, they manufactured fabrics for their clothes and linens for their households, signing their pieces with their initials. A woman from a more prosperous family could even acquire a cabinet in which to keep her goods, taking it with her when she married. More than women of the early 17th century, the women of the 18th century cherished their embroidered bedspreads and tablecloths and napkins, all carefully spun, cut, and sewn, as the movable property that they brought with them into their marriages. As men became busier with farm work and trades during the course of the 18th century, women also increasingly took over the weaving that many men had previously done, particularly in New England and the South. While much of what they produced was meant for their families, they also traded extra cloth for manufactured items at their local stores. Without actually working for wages, they still participated in the growing consumer revolution. Other women used their skills in casual wage work. In Maryland, for example, several white women from local farms worked for John Gresham, a prosperous plantation owner, spinning and knitting wool from his large flock of sheep to clothe his slaves. The goods that began to circulate in the colonies during the 18th century were not only making domestic life more pleasurable, but also creating new forms of social distinction. Wealthy shoppers could now choose from a variety of silks to make their clothing, and an even wider variety of carpets to furnish their homes. These luxury items were beyond the reach of more common folk, but this was not true of cheaper items, such as the highly prized Irish soap that many now purchased instead of making their own from ashes. And while wealthy matrons acquired elaborate tea services, even poorer consumers could purchase the tea that had become a popular new beverage. Throughout the colonies, households began to acquire plates, cutlery, and chairs, which allowed a family to sit at the same time when they ate dinner, without using their hands or without eating from the same bowl. These consumer products brought not only comfort to 18th century households, but also a struggle over social hierarchy, as the wealthy sought to distinguish themselves from more common folk, and common folk just as quickly sought to close the gap. Women became key players in the pursuit of status, and the proper use of those domestic goods became just as important as their acquisition. It was not enough to own a fancy tea service. A woman had to know how to properly serve tea and make polite conversation in the ritual that surrounded a tea party. More common women, who found their families sitting around a dinner table together, also had to orchestrate this new social event by providing greater attention to both the food they served and the conversation at mealtimes. By experimenting with these trappings of gentility, they could also experiment with new identities and new forms of sociability in their homes. Despite widespread participation as both producers and consumers in the market revolution unfolding around them, women did not necessarily fare well in this new economy. Changing patterns of inheritance, decreased access to the courts, and low wages were some of the problems women faced in the 18th century. As a result, economic participation did not translate into economic independence for most women. Although cities were growing during the 18th century, most colonists were farmers, and each generation struggled to provide enough land for the next. Some parents bought land farther west for their sons, provoking continuing conflicts with Indians. But they also made hard choices about inheritance. As land became more scarce, men became more likely to shortchange the inheritances of their wives and daughters to provide for their male heirs. In Pennsylvania, for example, women were increasingly less likely to inherit the traditional one-third share in their husband's estates. By the 1790s, a man could demand that the son who inherited the homestead take care of his mother, alleviating the man's need to leave any property to his wife so that she could support herself. Thus, widows began losing what little economic independence they had in earlier years. In New York, the loss of economic independence among women was even more pronounced, as English law supplanted Dutch law following the conquest of New York in 1664. The British allowed the Dutch to retain their inheritance laws, which allowed a widow one half of her husband's estate and allowed married women the right to own property. But families gradually intermarried with the British and Dutch customs faded. There were 134 female merchants in New Amsterdam when the British took over in 1664, but only 43 could be found in its incarnation as New York City a century later. Inheritance patterns also changed. Although Dutch men continued to will greater amounts of property to their wives and daughters than British men did, that custom too began to fade during the 18th century. Not surprisingly, as new forms of women's work, such as commercial dairy farming, expanded in New York during the 18th century, men commonly owned the equipment, though their wives and daughters did the work. In areas where British law had always dominated, women also faced increasing difficulties accessing the courts. In New Haven, Connecticut, for example, the courts of the 17th century had been dedicated to maintaining community harmony and had operated in a fairly casual fashion. Women as well as men participated in the informal proceedings, either testifying as witnesses or bringing forth their own grievances on issues that ranged from slander to economic disputes. This use of the courts became more difficult during the 18th century as local merchants began to hire lawyers rather than representing themselves, and most women were unable to afford the legal representation that 18th century courts were coming to expect. Women also faced increasing economic hardship in the more complex economy of the 18th century because they simply were not paid as much as men when they were compensated in cash wages. In the previous century, women might have achieved greater value for their work if they bartered their products, exchanging bread for rum, for example. Such exchanges became less common in the 18th century, particularly in urban areas where cash was more likely to be used. Wages for women fluctuated throughout the century, but women usually made only half as much as men. Poverty thus loomed as a real threat to women, particularly widows, whose numbers were growing as a result of the many wars of the 18th century. In Boston, as in other New England seaports, the number of widows had grown to 1,200 by mid-century, partly because so many men had died in various British military campaigns in Latin America. Most of these widows were quite poor and desperate to find support for themselves and their children. The Society for Encouraging Industry and the Employment of the Poor attempted to put these women to work in a small spinning factory, but the results were disappointing. Many women did not know how to spin, and others needed to work at home where they could care for their children and rely on their neighbors for help. As their struggles made clear, the new market economy offered little improvement in the lives of many poor women. The market revolution that brought new consumer goods to the shores of the colonies and kept shops up and down the eastern seaboard humming also underlay the explosive growth in the slave trade. Slavery supplied the demand for labor in seaport cities, in the rice and tobacco fields of the South, and on the smaller farms of the North. The different economic needs of each of these areas shaped the lives of slave women and gender roles in regionally distinct ways. As artisan and domestic workers, slaves were also ubiquitous in 18th century American cities, constituting 14% of the population of New York City at the time of the Revolution, and 20% of the working men in Philadelphia at mid-century. Because so many slaves in northern cities worked as artisans, slave men outnumbered slave women by significant proportion. The case was reversed in the southern cities of Savannah and Charleston, however, where slave women were used extensively for domestic work. In cities such as Charleston, slave women who worked as weavers and seamstresses and cooks also controlled much of the petty merchandising in their towns. Working from their street carts, they hawked goods grown by female slaves in the countryside, or fish caught and meat butchered by their menfolk. White citizens often complained of their noisy and aggressive behavior, branding the street hawkers as immoral women. Equally upsetting to whites was the way in which some urban slaves used their earnings to buy fine consumer goods, so that some slave women were alleged to dress as well as their mistresses. Outraged citizens repeatedly passed legislation forbidding slaves to wear such clothing, but the constant stream of laws suggests not only how threatening whites found the behavior, but also how little their legislation did to stop it. Thus, consumer goods provoked status conflicts not only between rich and poor, but also between slave and free. While urban slave women were sometimes able to manipulate the market economy in acquiring goods, they faced more of a challenge in having children. In cities such as New York, where masters had little extra space, slaves were often crammed into a back room and discouraged from marrying. Although a female slave could increase an urban slaveholder's capital by bearing children, most masters did not think the children worth the trouble. By the time of the Revolution, few slave women in either New York or Philadelphia were having children. If they did have children, they often died as infants. In the more settled areas of the Chesapeake region and farther inland in the newly cleared lands of the Piedmont region, balanced sex ratios helped slaves there to form families. Slaves living on smaller farms were more likely to be separated from their families than those living on large plantations. But in the Chesapeake region, a stable slave community was emerging in which many families were able to stay together. Children on larger plantations of the Chesapeake region were often able to live with their mothers, and possibly their fathers, though about one-third of these families were split up as slaves were moved farther inland to open up new tobacco fields in the Piedmont region. Farther south in the Carolinas and Georgia, slaves faced unbalanced sex ratios that affected both how they lived and how they worked. In the rice fields that dominated plantation life in this region, new slaves from Africa took on the grueling task of tending crops. In Africa, women had been responsible for this task, but in these areas of the South, where male slaves outnumbered female slaves by a substantial margin, men were expected to farm as well. Slave men, many just arrived from Africa, thus faced not only the degradation of slavery, but the further humiliation of being forced to do women's work. Slaves, like free people, were vital to the market economy of the 18th century. For women, this new world of goods could bring pleasure and new forms of socializing, but it could exacerbate poverty as well. In either case, women's lives were being transformed. Although men usually exerted more power through their access to the courts or in deciding who would receive an inheritance, traditional patterns of authority were questioned in other ways. In a wide variety of social and sexual relations, strict patriarchal control of the household, in particular, was challenged. As a result, women not only negotiated a new place in the market economy of the 18th century, they also negotiated new social and sexual identities. Eliza Lucas of South Carolina adored Pamela, the heroine of Samuel Richardson's 1740s novel Pamela, or Virtue Rewarded, one of the most popular English novels of the 18th century. She is a good girl, and as such I love her dearly, she wrote to her friend, Mary Barrett. Lucas and many other young women who could read made books one of the most popular British imports circulating throughout the colonies. Fictional works such as Pamela and Clarissa were tales of love and seduction that might end well, but might not. Key to their outcome was the moral backbone of the heroine, cultivated by loving parents who valued her personal feelings and self-reliance over her blind obedience. Pamela had the moral strength to resist the sexual demands of her employer. In Richardson's Clarissa, or The History of a Young Lady, on the other hand, tragedy resulted as an overbearing father prodded the heroine to marry a wealthy man she did not love, and in desperation she fled into the hands of an evil seducer. This was the fate of a child who knew only how to slavishly follow the will of her parents. Sentimental novels such as these were not only exciting to read, they popularized new ideas about human nature and social authority that were central to philosophical treatises written by Enlightenment philosophers such as John Locke. Locke had challenged Puritan beliefs that children were born with sinful natures, and instead argued that children learn to be good or evil as a result of their upbringing. Parents had to educate their children, not only formally, but also through example to act virtuously and independently. In both Locke's philosophy and in the popular literature that celebrated it, mindless subservience to one's father was not only unnecessary but also dangerous. Voluntary allegiance rather than patriarchal control was championed as the new basis for authority in the 18th century family. This was a message that resonated with many young people in the colonies as they created their own forms of independence. Lucy Barnes of Massachusetts, for example, had no love for her wealthy cousin John, whom her father wished her to marry. She chose Joseph Hosmer instead and made sure her parents would accept her choice by becoming pregnant. Barnes was not unusual in her behavior. By the time of the Revolution, 1 in 3 brides were pregnant when she married. Ideas of independence that young women picked up from popular literature was reinforced by the changing economic structure of the countryside. Fewer parents were able to provide inheritances for all of their children in the 18th century because fathers no longer had the land or wealth that had given economic clout to their patriarchal control in earlier generations. With little property at stake, daughters felt more freedom to choose a spouse they liked, even if their parents did not approve. Even more possibilities for sexual independence existed in cities, particularly in the rapidly growing multi-ethnic neighborhoods of Philadelphia. A tolerance for casual sexual encounters emerged along with a commitment to personal satisfaction in marital relationships. As the number of illegitimate children born each year increased, city officials made sure that fathers paid child support, but neither parent was punished for fornication. Popular forms of literature, such as almanacs, featured bawdy jokes about both men and women who reveled in their lusty behavior. And although legal divorces were hard to get, many spouses divorced informally by placing an advertisement in the local newspaper claiming to have been deserted. Most commonly, a man would claim his wife had left him and he would no longer be liable for her debts. But wives seldom contested such claims, suggesting they were comfortable with the announcement. Thus, in 1771, Robert Hill placed a notice in the Philadelphia newspapers that his wife Hannah had declared that, quote, "another man hath a better right to her than I have, and that she is desirous of parting from me, and being extremely willing to gratify her, I took her at her word." In both popular literature and in popular practice, ideals of household organization and household authority were being revised. Individuals looked for more personal satisfaction in their relationships and worried less about responding to their parents' wishes. Fathers often had fewer economic resources to offer their children, which undercut their authority. A new ideal of personal independence and fulfillment was emerging. Challenges to household authority also emerged from the fires of the Great Awakening that engulfed both men and women in the flames of religious enthusiasm during the 18th century. Beginning in the Middle Colonies as early as the 1720s, cresting in New England during the 1740s and 1750s, and continuing in the South through the 1760s, most parts of the Atlantic seacoast shared in the powerful and emotional religious experiences that not only transformed the lives of individuals, but also bound them together with believers across the Atlantic in various parts of Protestant Europe, extending into the Caribbean and even Africa. New religious denominations, such as the Methodists, arose as part of this fervor, while established denominations such as the Congregationalists and Presbyterians were torn apart. New Lights, as the revivalists were called, fought bitterly with the Old Lights, who sought to preserve the status quo within their churches. The New Lights emphasized the need for a powerful, physically felt conversion experience. Preachers encouraged such transformation with evocative, heartfelt preaching, quite distinct from the dry and learned sermons of many ministers. Hannah Heaton, a young woman from Connecticut, represented the response of many young converts when she recalled, quote, "I did vent out my anguish with tears and groans and a few broken specks." Critics argued that the emotionalism of the preaching and the enthusiasm of the audiences could easily turn a heavenly experience into an earthly one in which lust replaced piety. Certainly, the sight of swooning young women in the throes of religious ecstasy involved a lack of decorum that suggested sexual impropriety even where none existed. And a few very radical converts did leave their spouses for new ones after they were baptized. However, the greater challenge to family relations probably lay in the way that converted children declared independence from unconverted parents or a converted wife from her husband. The challenge to gender hierarchy became particularly clear as some women were inspired to preach God's word. Women's preaching usually began with witnessing as they spoke about God from their hearts to members of their congregation. But some women carried their role further, exhorting those who would listen to hear the word of God. Bathsheba Kingsley of Massachusetts, for example, was repeatedly hauled before her church elders and rebuked for her tendency to ride throughout the countryside, urging her neighbors to change their wicked ways. Because this new evangelical preaching was emotional and evocative, and because it required little in the way of formal theological training, anyone with a powerful voice and powerful convictions could become a preacher. Established clergymen bemoaned this challenge to the traditional order as not only women, but also African Americans and other members of the lower classes took to ranting in the countryside, and as large audiences flocked to hear them. Other women actually created new religions in this period of spiritual ferment, challenging gender ideals in their process of challenging accepted religions. Jemima Wilkinson, who was strongly influenced by Quaker beliefs, claimed to have died of typhus in 1776 and to have been resurrected as the public universal friend, who brought word to those on earth about the imminent arrival of God's second coming. As her new name, Public Universal Friend, suggested, she was neither a man nor a woman, and to further confuse gender issues, she eschewed traditional female clothing, choosing instead long flowing gowns that drew on male forms of dress as well as female. Like many of the preachers traveling the countryside, she preached spontaneously on biblical texts in a powerful voice that moved her audiences. Anne Lee, founder of the Shakers, arrived from England in the latter part of the 18th century and was equally charismatic. As an illiterate preacher, Lee had little use for the Bible she could not read and promoted instead a religious focused more on singing and dancing than on formal sermons. Other women fostered new ideas of gender relationships in the social activities they organized in their homes. This was particularly true in more elite households where women hosted social events promoting intellectual conversations and civilized discourse. Men in urban settings carried on political debates in the coffee houses and taverns that filled the cities. There they made business deals or discussed politics while sharing newspapers, playing cards, and drinking their favorite beverages. But in most cases, these spaces were off limits to women. As an alternative, elite women hosted afternoon tea parties at which men and women could mingle and share in light conversation. Critics sometimes dismiss such gatherings as little more than frivolous occasions for gossip, but their barbs inspired some women to improve the quality of conversation rather than to abandon their efforts at sociability. Elizabeth Macaulay of Philadelphia, for example, bemoaned the idle chatter of tea time and undertook a more ambitious project of promoting salons on the European model. Here, men and women shared in more elevated conversation about politics and literature, comparable to what might be found in coffee houses. Macaulay did not suggest that women use these events to decide political issues, but she did argue that women would provide an important level of refinement in the ensuing discussions. In promoting such interactions, Macaulay was drawing on new ideals of complementarity between men and women that emphasized differences between the sexes. While one important strain of Enlightenment thinking had followed Locke's emphasis on the natural rights of men, another group associated with the Scottish Enlightenment asserted that society was inherently unequal, but that each individual occupied an important position in the social hierarchy that carried both responsibilities and rights. This group emphasized the need for complementary roles between men and women in promoting social progress. Civilization reached its apex, many of these writers argued, when men and women worked together, each making different but complementary contributions to the social order that they were best suited to in their natural abilities. Sketches of History by Man by Lord Kames was one of the most widely circulated books to make such an argument, identifying key areas where women and men best use their different natures to advance society. Kames argued, for example, that men were strong so that they should be protectors of society, while women were delicate and better suited to being caregivers. Men had the intellectual abilities to rule, while women had the intellectual abilities to obey. Men were more creative and thus able to produce great art and literature, while female capabilities lay in promoting manners and civilization. Finally, men were more patriotic and dedicated to their government, while women were devoted to their families. All of these differences were good, Kames argued, because they allowed men and women to complement each other as they promoted social harmony rather than struggling against each other for power. Of course, men had the abilities that rendered them worthy of ruling, while women only possessed the capabilities to obey. Thus, complementarity meant that a new system of subordination could easily replace the older one. Whether stressing the importance of an individual's choice in marriage partner or the complementarity of the sexes, new ideas about patriarchal authority and women's roles within the family were emerging in the 18th century. As young couples courted and cavorted, and as matrons sought the attention of their husbands, women demanded respect for their opinions and their choices. To a certain extent, ideals of complementarity represented a new way of constituting family hierarchy as patriarchal authority was challenged. But these issues of authority were not only played out in 18th century families. In revolutionary struggles for independence that engulfed the colonies during the 1760s and 1770s, the attack on patriarchal authority took on political ramifications as colonists debated the practical applications of Enlightenment ideals such as natural rights, voluntary allegiance, and complementarity in the old government they attacked and the new government they created. Colonial dissatisfaction with British rule began to crystallize in the French and Indian War that had raged through the frontier from 1756 to 1763. Although the British wrested control from the French of the territory east of the Mississippi River, they still had to worry about many of the Indians still living there. Many of the tribes had sided with the French and killed more than 4,000 British settlers during the course of the war. But the British government sought to build peaceful relationships by designating the land west of the Appalachians as Indian Territory. Anglo colonists hungry for land were outraged by British policy. Colonists were further angered when the British government began to tax them to pay off the war debt. Protest turned to armed conflict by 1775, when shots were fired at Lexington and Concord. By the following year, colonial leaders, calling themselves patriots, were moving resolutely towards establishing a new government. Members of the Second Continental Congress, meeting in Philadelphia, issued the Declaration of Independence in July 1776. As fighting continued, the former colonies scrambled to write new state constitutions that reflected not only their transformation from colonial status, but also a broadening spectrum of participation by colonists in both the Revolution and their governments. Thomas Paine, a failed corset maker who had recently immigrated to Philadelphia from London, popularized many revolutionary ideas about popular political participation when he published Common Sense in 1776. The pamphlet went through numerous editions over the next few years as colonists read and debated the issues he raised. Most important, Paine challenged the idea that any king had a divine right to rule a country and argued instead that governments could and should be constituted by a social compact among individuals. This argument promoted the idea that each individual citizen, in making this social compact, should be granted the opportunity to participate in the government he had created. In this way, Paine popularized the important political concepts of rights advanced by Enlightenment thinkers such as John Locke, that men were born free in a state of nature and endowed equally with natural rights, but that in order to live in harmony and gain protection, they created a government to which they surrendered some of their rights. Just as novelists had popularized Locke's ideas of the importance of voluntary allegiance in the family, Paine popularized Locke's ideas of voluntary allegiance in the state. Inhabitants of the colonies who had not dreamed of participating in politics before now began to imagine a new political order in which they might have rights and responsibilities. Abigail Adams, who possessed the intelligence, curiosity, and stamina to not only compliment but challenge her politically ambitious husband John, recognized what these ideas could mean for women. Most famously, she sparred with her husband in the spring of 1776 as he debated with delegates of the Second Continental Congress about what their new government could look like. Pointing out to him that men were, quote, naturally tyrannical, Abigail enjoined her husband, quote, remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion, and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. John, clearly flustered at the unraveling of the social order implied in his wife's suggestion, could only reply in strained fashion that he had heard that our struggle has loosened the bonds of government everywhere, quote, that children and apprentices were disobedient, that schools and colleges were grown turbulent, that Indians slighted their guardians, and Negroes grew insolent to their masters. As he contemplated the ramifications of Abigail's demands, he concluded, quote, your letter was the first intimation that another tribe, more numerous and powerful than all the rest, were grown discontented. He should not have been surprised, though, for women were active participants in the political struggles engulfing their lives. By 1765, men throughout the colonies had begun to protest the oppressive taxes levied to pay for the French and Indian War. The Sugar Act of 1764 had been followed by the Stamp Act and the Quartering Act in 1765, and then the Townshend duties in 1767. Young Patrick Henry pushed resolutions against the duties through the Virginia House of Burgesses, while the Sons of Liberty in Boston roused angry crowds in Boston, and artisans in South Carolina hanged the stamp distributor in effigy. Resistance grew from New Hampshire through the Carolinas as colonists vowed to boycott British goods and to demonstrate their independence by providing for themselves. This strategy quickly drew women into the fray, for women were important consumers and producers of most household items. Young women began meeting together in spinning bees by 1769 in order to produce homespun cloth to replace English textiles. Often calling themselves Daughters of Liberty, as many as 90 women met at a time, sometimes in the home of their local congregational minister if he supported the cause. They produced not only yarn and cloth, but also a patriotic spectacle. Neighbors came by to watch the women and cheer them on. The Boston Evening Post celebrated the patriotism of New England women in helping to bring about the salvation of a whole continent. The activities of Southern women in producing homespun cloth were less likely to be noticed because they often lived on farms at great distances from one another, and thus they tended to spin alone without public recognition. Women soon joined with male patriots in boycotting other consumer goods that had become popular during the 18th century. Perhaps most notable was the boycott of tea. The Tea Act of 1773 had given the British East India Company the right to sell tea in the colonies without paying the same taxes as colonial merchants. The colonists viewed this favoritism as unfair to their own economic aspirations and responded by boycotting tea, an activity that women led because they were the chief consumers of tea. In Edenton, North Carolina, in 1774, 51 women highlighted the political implications of their activities by writing and signing a statement that they would not consume items that were being boycotted. Their behavior garnered attention on both sides of the Atlantic, as one Englishman compared the women to Amazons. By the time of the Revolution, some women were even more aggressive in their policing of consumption activities. As the war dragged on during the late 1770s, many items were in short supply and prices skyrocketed. Some merchants hoped to make a profit selling food, in particular to warring armies at whatever price they could fetch. Members of their communities, however, expected merchants to sell their goods at a price locals could afford. Patriot governments mandated price controls and set up committees to make sure they were enforced. Women as well as men were in the forefront of this movement. In Poughkeepsie, New York, for example, 22 women demanded that a merchant's wife sell her tea to her local community at a fair price in 1777. And the following day, several of them joined with men in the neighborhood to break into the house and open casks of liquor in further protest. About 1/3 of the food riots that took place during the Revolution involved women, either partially or exclusively. In Fishkill, New York, women were outraged when Jacobus Lefferts refused to sell his tea at the price established by the Continental Congress in 1776. Seizing his goods and selling it for the price approved by the Patriots, the women promised to donate the proceeds to the revolutionary cause. In the summer of 1777, women in Boston rioted over food prices and at one point captured Thomas Boylston and liberated the coffee he was hoarding. In each case, women connected their role as consumers with the revolutionary cause they were supporting. Women also worked tirelessly throughout the colonies as fundraisers for the Patriot cause. Their most successful effort occurred as Esther de Burt Reed and Sarah Franklin Bash, the daughter of Benjamin Franklin, spearheaded a major fundraising drive in Philadelphia to provide money to the soldiers in the Continental Army. Organizing women to go door to door asking for donations, the campaign was a stunning success, garnering $300,000. Reed had hoped to give each soldier $2 in specie, but Washington forbade her, arguing that the money would undercut his own attempts to pay his men in paper currency, and that they were likely to spend it in inappropriate ways. Finally, he agreed to let the women contribute over 2,000 shirts to the troops. Women in other states followed suit with their own fundraising drives. In addition to shirts, however, many women were kept busy at their spinning wheels and looms, providing cloth and blankets for Army procurement officers. Through the production of clothes and the purchase of food, which were traditional female activities, they took on an important political overtones as the Revolution unfolded. Women's feelings of independence also surfaced as they expanded their roles as deputy husbands, taking over the farms and shops of their husbands who had headed off to battle. One woman remembered the way her grandmother would saddle her horse and supervise workers on their extensive farm and ironworks before breakfast, and then turn her attention to the children and household after breakfast. Mary Bartlett of New Hampshire gradually shifted her reports on the farm she had taken over for her husband, referring at first to, quote, your farming business, but later to, quote, our farming business. Less fortunate women had to scramble to earn whatever money they could to make up for the lack of income from their spouses. Mercy Otis Warren came from a prominent Massachusetts family and received an excellent education with her brothers. Her education was put to good use as resistance to Great Britain mounted in the colonies, and her brothers and husband were drawn into the fray. Patriot leaders quickly came to appreciate Warren's intelligence, so much so that they counted on her writings to defend and spur the Patriot cause. Writing anonymously during the 1770s, Warren published a string of plays and poems lampooning the British and urging on the colonists in their resistance. She skewered the British governor Thomas Hutchinson in two plays, The Adulator and The Defeat. After the Boston Tea Party, John Adams encouraged her to memorialize the event, and she did in a poem entitled The Squabble of the Sea Nymphs. She encouraged women to support the boycott of British goods in a later poem and celebrated the virtue of the colonists in yet another. Her pamphlet The Group, published as war broke out in 1775, satirized the Loyalists of Boston. As the Revolution progressed, and later as the infant republic faced its earliest crises, Warren continued to write poems about the importance of the Republican vision and her fears that many patriots were straying from the path of political virtue. This was the theme that would animate her greatest work, The History of the American Revolution, written over 30 years and finally published in 1805. While Mercy Otis Warren ventured further than any other woman during the Revolution in engaging in the political debates that animated colonial resistance, she did not translate that activism into a larger critique of her place in a patriarchal society. She engaged in political debate with both men and women, and she believed that political ideas that came from women were as valid as those espoused by men. But she also believed that men and women were different in nature, and that because of their different natures, women were suited to the domestic world, while men were suited to the world of politics and economy. Her writing was important, but her family duties were paramount. Those women who supported the Loyalist cause, and they were a significant minority, occupied a more politically ambiguous and economically vulnerable position than did women who supported the Patriot cause. As tensions with England began to unfold, their local social networks collapsed, leaving them isolated from friends and neighbors. Whether they wished it or not, a political identity was thrust upon them. For Loyalist women, feelings of isolation began with the growing hostilities over British taxes. Social events became occasions for political debate, driving wedges into friendships. Shopkeepers who refused to participate in boycotts found their goods and homes under attack. Christian Barnes of Boston complained bitterly of the attacks on her and her husband by the Sons of Liberty, whom she condemned as a set of wretches. After war broke out, many men were forced to take a loyalty oath to the Patriot cause or face imprisonment. Loyalist men either joined the British forces or moved into territory controlled by the British. Their wives often stayed behind, trying to protect their homes and their children as the war unfolded around them. Patriot forces regarded them with suspicion, however, and expelled them when they gained sufficient control of an area. The wives of many Loyalists were driven from Newark, New Jersey in 1777, as were Loyalist wives of Philadelphia in 1780. Those who had not already left their homes by the end of the war certainly did so after the British surrender. They left behind their land, most of their valuables, and the people they had known. Some settled in England, while others headed to Canada or even the Caribbean. In their petitions to the British government, many revealed their loneliness and desolation as they requested financial assistance. They highlighted not only their poverty, but also their isolation from friends and family they had left behind. "I am without friends or money," one petitioner explained, "a friendless, forlorn woman." Whether they sided with the Patriots or the Loyalists, women could not help but be caught up in the military conflict. Although both the British and colonial armies were composed of men, a straggling crew of the poorest women and children who had no way to support themselves without their husbands off fighting a war were present as camp followers. Washington found them a nuisance, but he also recognized that many of his men would desert if they felt their families needed them at home. Making the best of what he considered a bad situation, Washington allowed them to receive partial rations and encouraged them to make themselves useful. Women were indeed useful in the war effort. They sold food and supplies to the troops as they moved from place to place, as well as cooking, sewing, and washing clothes for their husbands and other soldiers. Indeed, the British soldiers, who traveled with women as well, had noted as early as the French and Indian War that the colonial soldiers were a ragged-looking lot because they did not have enough women to clean and mend their clothes. Women also nursed their husbands or worked officially in foul-smelling army hospitals. Though women were paid for their labors, their pay was lower than what men received for comparable jobs. Female nurses and matrons earned less money than male stable hands. Not surprisingly, the laundresses in one camp went on strike to demand fair pay. Some women even moved with their husbands to the battlefront, carrying buckets of water to quench the thirst of fighting men and to douse the overheated cannons the men were firing. The name Molly Pitcher evolved as a term for women who took on this task and was applied most famously to Mary Ludwig Hayes, who took over loading her husband's cannon at the Battle of Monmouth in 1778. Deborah Sampson, who had no menfolk to follow, disguised herself and served as a soldier for several years before she was wounded and her true sexual identity became clear to an army surgeon. Class also played an important role in the way women participated in military life. The poor and ragged camp followers were viewed as troublesome and dangerous by commanding officers who commented on their ugliness, dirtiness, and need for discipline. Officers' wives, however, were another matter. Officers from Washington down welcomed their female family members, particularly during long winters when balls and teas created a lively social scene in their homes where officers had taken up temporary residence. Elizabeth Schuyler met her future husband, Alexander Hamilton, in this context, and she was not the only young lady to snag a dashing officer. As the battlefields shifted up and down the colonial coast, even women who were not camp followers found themselves pressed into military service. When troops they supported moved into the vicinity, women would vie for opportunities to house the men they supported, particularly if there was a chance they would be paid for their efforts. At other times, women were forced to house soldiers of the opposing army when their land fell into enemy possession. In those cases, women might be less welcoming. Their homes were not only invaded, but vandalized. Lydia Minturn Post of Long Island complained bitterly of the damage her Hessian guests did to her property as she was forced to lodge them. Elizabeth Wilsty, a loyalist of New Hampshire, stood by helplessly while Patriot forces stole her furniture, destroyed her bedding, and pried the logs off her house. A few women faced even greater trials when subjected to violence by opposing troops. Women in Staten Island and New Jersey were raped by invading British and Hessian soldiers in 1776, as were women in New Haven and Fairfield, Connecticut during 1779. Abigail Palmer of New Jersey was only 13 when she was raped by British troops in 1777. Farther south, several of the McDonald girls were stripped by Patriot soldiers in North Carolina. Other women lost their lives, including Hannah Caldwell, who was murdered by a British soldier in search of loot. Caldwell's murder became a rallying cry for the Patriot forces, as did the death of Jane McCree. McCree's family was split, with some supporting the Loyalist cause and others supporting the Patriot cause. She herself was engaged to a Loyalist officer when Indians, who were allied with the British, captured her. In a dispute over the young woman, the Indians scalped her, galvanizing the Patriot troops her fiancé opposed. Indeed, in frontier areas where conflict with Indians was endemic, women were sometimes taken captive. In the largest of these raids, 170 women and children from Kentucky were captured by Indians and taken to Canada. Some women retaliated, though. While soldiers thought nothing of imposing on female hospitality and more or less expected women to be non-political bystanders in the war, some women took advantage of this naivete and bravely crossed enemy lines to share the information they had gathered with the side they supported. Others, in less dramatic fashion, simply provided a place for soldiers to stay as they tried to elude capture from their enemies. Facing severe punishments if they were caught, patriot and loyalist women secretly assisted soldiers and spied for the forces they supported. For Native American women and for slave women, the Revolution raised issues of independence that were different from those confronting Euro-American women. Native American women and men had to calculate which side in this colonial struggle was more likely to protect them from land-hungry colonists. Slaves calculated questions of independence in terms of freedom from bondage. They recognized that the demands for freedom being voiced by the colonists could be extended into a critique of slavery as well. However, while some slaves fought for freedom within the rhetoric of revolution, others thought their chances for freedom were better with the British. Most Native Americans agreed with them. Neither Indians nor slaves, however, were particularly interested in the political differences between the Patriots and the Loyalists. Neither were the Euro-Americans much interested in the oppression faced by their allies. The alliances these groups formed were purely strategic. Most Indian tribes fought with the British, calculating that the British were more likely to honor their boundaries than the colonists were. Despite various efforts by the British to hold back Anglo settlements west of the Appalachians, thousands of farmers, hunters, traders, and land speculators had pushed into these lands during the 18th century, sparking a series of bloody conflicts. Compared to these rapacious colonists, the British government seemed like the lesser of two evils. Many Indian groups had hoped to avoid participating in the conflict at all, viewing it as a conflict among Europeans. However, as conflict spread from New England to Canada as early as 1777, the Iroquois Confederacy realized it would be drawn in. Mary, or Molly Brant, a powerful Mohawk matron who had been married to Sir William Johnson, the British Superintendent of Indian Affairs in the North, worked assiduously to build support for the British among the Iroquois Confederacy. She used her membership in the Society of Six Nations matrons to persuade other women to support the war, and to encourage their men to join the Loyalists. Like most Loyalist women, Brant was eventually forced to leave her home and all of her possessions for a new life in Canada. Regardless of which side Indians fought on, conflict on the frontier was vicious, and as a result, Indian women and children left behind in the villages suffered some of the worst excesses of military brutality. One chief claimed that Patriot troops had put to death all the women and children in his village, saving only a few girls, whom they carried away for the use of their soldiers. Some Indian women were mutilated after they were murdered, as their wombs were torn out of their bodies. Those who survived such attacks faced starvation and bitter cold as troops burned their fields and their houses. Mary Jimison, who had been captured by the Seneca Indians when a child and who had chosen to stay with the Senecas even though she was later ransomed by her relatives, described vividly how Patriot forces had destroyed their crops and their homes. They had not a mouthful of any kind of sustenance left, not even enough to keep a child one day from perishing of hunger. Slaves had also been drawn into the war early on when in 1775 Lord Dunmore, governor of Virginia, issued a proclamation that any slaves in his colony willing to take up arms against their masters would be granted their freedom. 300 male slaves quickly mustered into the Ethiopian regiment. During the course of the war, over 80,000 slaves fled their masters, many taking their chances with the British. The offer of potential freedom behind British lines had a particularly powerful impact on women. Slave women had been much less likely than slave men to run away during the colonial period because they often had small children who could not travel long distances to freedom in Florida or other colonies on the frontier. However, as the British Army drew closer to slave populations in both the North and the South during different periods of the war, that calculation changed and women became much more likely to make a bid for freedom. Of the 23 slaves who fled Thomas Jefferson's Virginia plantation, more than half were female. Over 40% of more than 2,800 ex-slaves who left with the British at the end of the war, were female. Once behind British lines, however, slave women faced a new set of trials. Women were not allowed to bear arms, but they took on other duties of camp followers in nursing the sick, cooking, and doing laundry. Many died in these camps as epidemics repeatedly struck. When Lord Dunmore evacuated Virginia, for example, a smallpox epidemic broke out on his ships, and he left his African American followers on an island in the Chesapeake Bay, where many died alone and unattended. Not all slaves supported the British. Others assisted patriot troops and attempted to extend revolutionary rhetoric about freedom into their own lives. As the Revolution drew to a close, the Massachusetts slave Mumbette, who would later take the name Elizabeth Freeman, sued for her freedom and won. She argued that her enslavement violated the promise of liberty that was central to the state constitution, and eventually, slavery was ruled unconstitutional in Massachusetts. Slowly, other states in the North also abolished the practice, though slaves could be found in some parts of the North through the 1820s. In the South, such arguments for African American freedom largely fell on deaf ears. Some Southern slave owners did free their slaves, but by the end of the century, slavery in the South was stronger than ever. Although women such as Elizabeth Freeman had tried to extend arguments for liberty to include slavery, their impact was limited.
In the heady days of 1776, as states debated the nature of their new governments, most men were no more interested in extending political rights to women than extending them to slaves. Delegates to constitutional conventions were much more focused on the extent to which uneducated and propertyless men would have access to political party. Elites worried that a completely democratic society would degenerate into the tyranny of ignorant masses with little respect for property rights. Poor farmers and artisans who were fighting to defend the patriot cause argued that such mistrust was unfair. In New Jersey, however, this debate unexpectedly affected women when the state constitution was written in 1776. The New Jersey Constitution dealt with the conflict between property holders and commoners by extending the right to vote to women, but insisting on a property qualification. All adults who possessed at least 50 pounds of property were given the right to vote. Married women would not have qualified under these rules because they legally could not own property, but some single women did. Most likely, these women were being counted upon to uphold the rights of property holders in case poorer men challenged them. As a result, single women with property received an important new right, and they used it. The inclusion of women as voters in the New Jersey Constitution did not arouse much comment, though by the 1790s criticism was growing. This was due in no small part to the growing competition between the Federalists and the Jeffersonian Republicans for the allegiance of voters. The Federalists were committed to a strong central government and the promotion of commerce, while the Republicans were committed to a weaker central government and the interests of farmers. Each faction viewed the other with alarm. As the two young parties jockeyed to promote their particular causes, they calculated where their support might be found. And among the groups they sized up and courted were the female voters of the state. The Federalists rounded up women in a hotly contested election in 1797. However, they soon began to fear that women might favor the Republicans. In the end, neither the Republicans nor the Federalists felt there was enough to be gained in courting the women, and both sides dropped support for the female franchise when the state constitution was rewritten in 1807. Although women had actively used the vote while they had it, they did not protest their disenfranchisement when it occurred. While the New Jersey experiment with female voting was an anomaly in female political participation during the Revolutionary period, petitioning was not. Petitions were a way subjects could approach their government directly to request anything from personal assistance to a change in the law. Few women used petitions before the Revolution, but during and after the war, an increasing number of women began to petition their governments. Some petitioned the Continental Congress or various state legislatures for economic relief, if widowed, or economic payment if they had rendered service to the government. Abigail Ott and Mary Munn of Pennsylvania no longer had their husbands to support them and were starving. Non Helema, an Indian woman, requested payment for tending the cattle of Americans fighting at Fort Randolph in the Ohio River. Mary Sansom of Charleston petitioned the state of South Carolina for back pay she believed owed to her dead husband. Hundreds of these petitions flooded the legislatures of the states during and after the war. As women became more comfortable petitioning the government, they also began to use this approach collectively, in a few instances to address issues of policy. In Charleston, 9 slave-owning widows protested legislation in 1783 that prohibited slave women from selling their goods in the streets. Many of these slaves were there at the behest of their mistresses, who counted on the income to support themselves. A few years later, 67 seamstresses in South Carolina signed another petition requesting a higher tariff on the imported clothing that was providing stiff competition to their goods and driving them out of business. As their behavior made clear, women did not have the same political rights as men, but they did have political consciousness. The new United States government faced constant turmoil in its early years. The Articles of Confederation, which had been adopted by the Second Continental Congress in 1777, was abandoned 10 years later as too weak to hold the national government together. The United States Constitution replaced it in 1787. Debates about the national government were echoed in each state as separate constitutions were written and rewritten. Repeatedly, Americans asked themselves and each other how far the Revolution would go in granting rights and promoting democracy. Debates such as these framed questions about the rights of women in the new republic. In the celebrations that followed the revolutionary victory, the citizens of the new republic repeatedly toasted the role of patriotic women. Their fortitude, their virtue, and their good sense were widely acknowledged. Women themselves boasted of their political acumen. Margaret Manigault, for example, claimed that she could, quote, read the papers and talk learnedly about them all, when she described herself as a great politician. Young women in the North and South talked freely of the new president, the Constitution, and other more local political affairs. This political awareness, however, did not lead women into political power. Rather, a consensus rapidly developed that women had proven themselves worthy and capable of rearing virtuous citizens in the new republic. The emphasis on child rearing was a serious concern. In the uncharted waters of a new Republican form of government, citizens worried about whether or not the electorate would be suitably trained to govern itself. Although they had grown frustrated with British rule, the revolutionary generation had grown up with a belief that the monarchy provided crucial stability in a government. Citizens of the United States took seriously the need to create stability in new ways with an educated and selfless public. Elites had viewed property holding as one way of ensuring the capabilities of voters, but a new confidence also began to emerge in the capabilities of women. A well-educated and virtuous woman would be a valuable sounding board for her husband and a trusted educator for their children. Journals of the time thus suggested that men looked for wisdom and patience in a wife rather than beauty and wealth, and women were urged to wed men who would treat them as friends. These would be marriages in which men and women would share advice and contemplate problems that could have political ramifications as well as personal. Child rearing should have a similar purpose. Thus, Mary Cranch was proud of developing her son's capacity to reason. When anything was demanded of you, the reason was given why it ought to be done, she told him later. This youthful training, her comment implied, had given him the skills to listen thoughtfully to political debate and act judiciously for the common good. Those who championed the responsibility of women to educate their children and advise their husbands argued that it was not only their duty but also their right. Men had the right to vote, but women had the right to influence. The Lockean ideas of natural equality and social contract that had been popularized by Thomas Paine and written in the Declaration of Independence were not applied to women. The belief that men and women had different rights came from the Scottish Enlightenment tradition that stressed that individuals had different rights depending on their rank. The rights of women, when conceived in this way, were not only different from the rights of men, they were actually derived from a very different political tradition. The most significant change in the lives of women following the Revolution was their growing access to education so they could successfully assume their roles within their families. Advanced academies for elite girls proliferated, particularly in the North, where even the daughters of farmers and shopkeepers were more likely to gain a basic knowledge of reading and writing at local schools. Girls of modest backgrounds usually received their education in summer sessions at the town school. Of course, not all towns had schools, and even if they did, they would not necessarily allow girls to enroll, or they could refuse to pay for the instruction of girls. But in Massachusetts, for example, girls were more likely to find these opportunities by the 1790s than earlier in the century. In Philadelphia, abolitionists even opened a school for girls who have been slaves because they would not have been able to attend a school for white children. Not surprisingly, female literacy rose. Female academies provided more advanced learning. Many of these academies were founded in the North rather than in the South because the Southern countryside had been so devastated by revolutionary battles and recovery in the South was proceeding slowly. In small towns and large cities of Pennsylvania, New York, Connecticut, and Massachusetts, educated women such as Susanna Rosen and Sarah Pierce opened establishments that drew young women from great distances. While many of these schools taught music, dancing, and embroidery, they also stressed reading, writing, and basic arithmetic, as well as offering lessons in history and geography. Benjamin Rush, an important physician who argued that Pennsylvania needed public schools to educate both boys and girls for participation in the new nation, also helped to found the private Young Ladies Academy in Philadelphia. He argued that girls needed to be educated to instill patriotism in their children, and that women needed to learn good handwriting and basic mathematics to assist their husbands in their businesses. Not everyone accepted the idea that girls needed to be educated or that they were even capable of learning traditionally male subjects such as history and mathematics. Thus, a debate developed about the intellectual capabilities of women, with some writers going far beyond the demands of those who supported Republican motherhood, arguing instead that men and women were intellectual equals and that education was an important way to create independent women. Mary Wollstonecraft of England took this position in 1792 in her A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, which circulated widely in Europe and the United States. She claimed that while there were physical differences between men and women, female character had been shaped by environment rather than internal nature. Wollstonecraft argued that not only should boys and girls study the same subjects, but that they should be educated together. Judith Sargent Murray of Boston, an important essayist in the late 18th century, saw her essays as a complement to Wollstonecraft's. In her writings, she argued that women needed to be educated so that they would know how to best influence their families. But she also pointed out that educated women would have the ability to support their children if something happened to their husbands. In this way, Murray raised the possibility that education could lead to female independence. The radical implications of her arguments became clear as she claimed that women were capable of such an education because they were, quote, in every respect equal to men. Whether in fortitude or patriotism, governing or literacy accomplishment, women were just as capable as men. Murray challenged the assumptions about female nature that underlay the gender philosophy of the Scottish Enlightenment and the status hierarchy of Republican womanhood. Although few women openly espoused Murray's arguments, she was not alone in discussing female equality. Some young women preferred the rights of men to those that had been allocated to women. When Priscilla Mason delivered an oration in 1794 at her graduation from the newly established Young Ladies Academy of Philadelphia, she not only celebrated her extraordinary education, but also decried the mighty lords who with their arbitrary constitutions have denied us the means of knowledge, and then reproached us for the want of it. Turning to the broader political landscape, she further complained, "The church, the bar, and the Senate are shut against us. Who shut them? Man, despotic man." Anne Harker, another young graduate of the Young Ladies Academy, was clearly in agreement, arguing, "In opposition to your immortal pain, we will exalt our Wollstonecraft." The celebration of the Republican mother, virtuous wife, and educated daughter in the years following the Revolution suggests the ways in which ideas about the family had shifted along with ideals about the political order. The growing emphasis on companionship in marriage and equality in family relations also surfaced in some of the new laws that were drafted about divorce and inheritance. However, democracy in family and personal relationships was not always realized. New ideas about family may have provided elite women with status more than power and consigned poor women to an even more marginal position in society. As each state rewrote their laws of inheritance after the Revolution, most changed the rules about how a father's property would be distributed if he died without writing a will. British law had stipulated that in such circumstances, the oldest son would receive twice as much as his brothers and sisters. In the new republic, 10 of the 13 new states rewrote these statutes to provide equal shares to all children in a family. While this legislation was meant to create more economic equality among siblings, fathers could easily ignore the law by simply writing their own wills. Those who did tended to continue the trend that had begun before the Revolution of trying to equalize the amount of property they willed to their sons by giving less to their daughters. Most states, with the notable exception of South Carolina, also broke with British tradition by legalizing divorce, although only in very restricted circumstances. Puritans in New England had always recognized divorce, and Quakers in Pennsylvania also had been sympathetic to the idea because these religious groups viewed marriage as a civil contract, not a religious one. The English government had disagreed with this perspective, however, and had challenged the divorce statutes of these colonies while they were still under British rule. After the Revolution, more lenient divorce laws were finally enacted. Divorce was still a difficult process, however. Laws varied with each state, but in most cases, women and men had to petition state legislatures to receive a divorce, and usually only the most wealthy of women had the money and political connections to do so. Regardless of whether or not legal divorces were within their reach, some women did continue to engage in a sexually expressive culture, at least in the first few years of the new republic. In Philadelphia, in particular, cases continued to proliferate of women who had children out of wedlock with few consequences, and others who left their husbands when they found another who suited them better. However, arguments for sexual chastity began to increase in newspapers and journals of the day, as women in particular were urged to curb the licentious behavior of men. Female responsibilities for guarding Republican virtue were extended from politics and education to encompass sexuality as well. As one gentleman wrote to the Philadelphia Minerva, "Ladies, much depends on you towards a reformation in the morals of our sex." This new approach to sexuality had important class implications because openly sexual behavior became associated with women of the lower classes. Servants, street hawkers, slaves, and poor women generally were excluded from this vision of virtuous womanhood. Men could engage in sexual relationships with these women because men were not charged with guarding the family virtue of the new republic, as their wives and sisters were. A double standard emerged in which respectable women were expected to restrain their sexuality as a way of promoting the virtue of the nation in a way that men were not. Another form of gender complementarity between the sexes of the respectable classes. As was true of gender complementarity generally, the sexual double standard was rooted in inequality. Men were allowed sexual freedoms that women were not, and poor women were further marginalized as unworthy of either respect or responsibility within society. The 18th century truly had been an age of revolution for women. Consumer goods and a lively market economy had transformed their lives as both producers and consumers. Family life had changed as patriarchal authority was challenged on numerous levels, both small and grand, and a new republic of rights had been established. But the tradition of rights for men was different from the one established for women. For men, the tradition of natural rights had opened the door to political access and debates about equality. For women, however, rights were rooted in a very different tradition. one premised on inequality and the need for women to exercise their rights within their homes, not in public. This tradition of differences would define the debates about women's political status for the next 2 centuries.